So you know how for the past couple of years, Apple's been doing a special iPhone? Like they did the XR, then the Mini, then the Plus, and now the Air, which I think is one of the better ones because I've had this thing since launch. I've been testing it thoroughly, especially some of the controversial things about this phone, like the battery life, the build quality, the speakers, the cameras, and of course, other things. And you know, while my expectations weren't exactly high, this phone continues to surpass them with flying colors. In fact, the more I use this phone, the more I just like it, which is weird because this was like the last phone I thought I was actually going to like. But at the same time, it's difficult for me to recommend this phone. Let me explain. So when Apple announced this phone, I was among the many people who initially thought that this phone was not going to have good battery life. And I guess I was wrong because this phone has a good battery life. There's a 3,149 milliamp hour battery inside, which isn't anything big by today's standards, but I can still comfortably get 5+ hours of screen on time and still have like 30+% battery remaining at the end of the day. In fact, this phone has actually never went below 30% until I forgot to charge it one night, and then I used it the next day for another 2.5 hours, and only then it went to like 5%, which is impressive considering this form factor. I do also have the battery pack for this phone, and you know, while I never really felt the need to use it because again the phone itself has sufficient battery for my needs, I tried using it and I was able to get slightly better results, but generally speaking you can expect to get around 65% extra battery from this. But it costs $100 and I wouldn't actually recommend you get this, but I'll talk more about this a little bit later. It'll make more sense. Number 2, build quality. This thing is solid. You do not have to worry about this thing bending at all. It definitely flexes a lot though, if you look at it from a side angle, but it's not gonna bend. Don't worry about it. In fact, this is the most durable iPhone that currently exists. And all of that has to do with the titanium frame. It's very, very durable. It's shiny and actually just makes this phone look like a jewelry or a fashion accessories more than a phone. But it really does give this phone a premium feel. It makes it feel like an iPhone, if you know what I mean. But it can still get scratched and cracked because this is glass at the back, so you're gonna get a case for it. So if you're looking for something very, very protective and durable, you cannot go wrong with the D-brand tank case. This thing is built like a tank. It's got a ton of bold texture all over to give you a good grip of the phone. It works perfectly with all MagSafe accessories and of course the battery pack, and the magnets are very strong. But my favorite part is that you can actually get custom colored buttons for this thing and replace them. Right now I'm using orange colored buttons and they just make this case look even more utilitarian and rugged. It gives it that Apple Watch Ultra kind of vibe, which just looks really nice. And while you're at it, pick up the Prism 2.0 screen protector for this phone as well and use code SPIXEL. You can get 42% off the Prism. You're welcome. I'll leave links below. Check it out. Number 3, the speakers, or I should say speaker, because this phone only has one, but it is surprisingly better than my expectations. It's not tinny, doesn't sound terrible. It actually sounds pretty good. However, if you're gonna watch videos on this phone in landscape or in full screen, it definitely feels a little weird to use this phone because all the sound is coming from one side. So it kind of feels like one of your ears isn't working properly. So you kind of have to get used to that, but it does not sound bad at all. It's definitely not as good as what's on the Pros or even the base model iPhone. This is definitely worse, but is it good for watching videos, video calls, stuff like that? Absolutely. Number 4, the cameras. So this phone has 2, one selfie camera and one main camera. The selfie camera is a huge upgrade this year across the entire 17 lineup and the Air. It's significantly better than older iPhones. It has a higher megapixel count, 24 versus 12 on older iPhones, and it has a bigger sensor, which means it can capture more light, more detail, and just gives you better results. And the sensor is square, which means you can capture photos and videos in landscape without having to rotate your phone sideways, which is actually a pretty big deal in my opinion, because for people who actually use the selfie camera a lot, it's gonna make it way easier to capture photos and videos in landscape. It also just looks way more natural because the camera is actually in perfect alignment with your eyes instead of being to the side, which can look kind of weird. It looks more like a real camera that you can use to record yourself, where the lens is perfectly in the alignment with the eyes. However, I'm not someone who uses a selfie camera a lot. I care way more about the cameras on the back. And the one here is good. It takes good photos and videos in different lighting conditions, whether it's daylight or low light, but mainly in daylight. If you give it plenty of light, it looks really good. Even in low light, it will get you pretty good results. However, I think a huge misconception people have is that this is the same camera as what's on the 17 Pros, because even from Apple's own keynote, it wasn't super clear to me if this is the same or different, but it is completely different. It is a 48 megapixel camera, which is the same megapixel count as the 17 Pro main camera, but the sensor size are different. On the 17 Pro, the main sensor is around 49% larger, which means it can capture way more light, way more detail, and it will give you much better results in low light. And you can actually see that. Low light photos from the 17 Pro look much better. It's also not quite as wide as the 17 Pros because this lens is a 26mm equivalent versus 24 on the 17 Pros. And not to mention all the other pro features the 17 Pro has, like being able to record log video, raw video, take raw photos. All of those things you cannot do on the Air. But to be fair, if you don't really know what half of those things mean, then you probably shouldn't care about this. Then for you, this camera should be fine. For normal consumers, this is a pretty good camera. However, for me, the biggest deal breaker here is the lack of an ultra-wide angle camera. Because you see, when it comes to taking zoom photos, even if there is no telephoto camera, I'm fine with losing a little bit of quality and just cropping in. Fine with that, as long as I'm getting sort of the shot what I'm looking for. However, if I need to take an ultra-wide photo, I can't do that. It's just not possible because that lens doesn't exist on this phone. So for me, that's the biggest deal breaker. You also can't take macro photos because the ultra-wide angle camera is used for macro photos, but I guess I can look past that. So those were some of the controversial things about these phones, and after using it, they don't really feel like too big of a problem. However, I also noticed some other things using this phone. One of them was the screen. So you see, normally I'm not a huge fan of big screens because I don't have huge hands, so it's really difficult for me to use the phone with one hand. However, I noticed with this phone, even though it has a 6.5-inch screen, it's actually not that difficult to use this. It turns out as the phone gets thinner, it's easier to wrap your fingers around the phone. So for example, on the 17 Pro, if I try to wrap my hand as tightly as I possibly can and try to touch my thumb and the middle finger together, I can do it. On the Air, you can see I can do basically the same thing as I can do on the Pro, which means it's not actually that hard to reach the other end of the screen with your thumb. It's very similar to using a Pro. I do want to make it clear though, it is still easier to use the Pro because of the smaller screen, but it's not as hard to use the Air as I thought it would be. And by the way, I'm also recording on the new selfie camera. This is kind of what it looks and sounds like. But you still get the bigger screen size, which is way better for playing games, watching content, and it just feels more immersive. And because this phone is thinner, it kind of just feels like you're using a sheet of glass, which feels very futuristic, very different than any other iPhone. And if you actually get used to using this thing, any normal phone just feels like a literal brick in your hand. Number two, I also noticed that this phone tends to heat up a little bit. Nothing too serious or concerning, but just an observation I made because this phone has titanium, which is the same as the 16 Pro, so the thermals are not as good as they are on the 17 Pro, so just tends to get warm a little bit sometimes. So overall, I really like this phone. It's just really fun to use, and it's a different experience that I haven't felt in a very long time. However, the thing is, it's hard to recommend this phone because of battery life. You see, the battery life is good, but it's not so good that if you actually are someone who uses their phone a lot, you need good battery life, this isn't going to cut it for you. So you might think I'll pick up the battery bank, but at this point, this entire package is a terrible deal because this is literally $1 cheaper than the 17 Pro, which is a much better phone than this. It gives you better battery life, better cameras, and it's the one I would actually recommend then at that point. And then you cannot forget that the normal 17 also exists, which is just as good as this phone in some ways, maybe even better in some ways because you have the ultra-wide angle camera, and it's $200 cheaper. However, if you still want to get this phone, you do not care about the things it's missing and the price point and all of that. And if that's the case, then sure, go ahead and buy this. It's definitely a good phone, just difficult for me to recommend considering the other options that exist. But that's all for this video. I will see you later.